If rabbits are so easy to raise and they taste just like chicken, then why didn't they get any part of the industry? Sounds to me like we've got a good, industry mystery on our hands.
Good morning, everybody. Today we're going to talk about how rabbits got pushed out of the food system in favor for some other bullshit. Lord, it stinks out here. Don't mind me if I'm crying on camera because I think my eyeballs are allergic to mascara. So if any of you city girls know any mascaras that I can use that won't make me look like I'm crying about fucking everything, please let me know. I'm about to just go find a cave somewhere, go scrape some bat shit off of the cave, and use that stuff instead. I don't know if it's safe or effective, but we might just have to figure that out. Yay, my ducks are laying eggs again. So the basis of our story today, we're going to start way back in like the 40s. Actually, let's go back to the 30s. The 30s is Great Depression, 1933-ish. And that, I believe, is when subsidies were invented for like corn and soy. Yeah, we're going back that far. So before bomb fluid became regular fertilizer, instead, they used normal things like crop rotation, manure, mineral applications, slaughter animal warehouse parts that were left over, bone meal. It all just got like basically turned into fertilizer, fish scraps, stuff like that. During World War II, everything was pretty much grown using natural means, the old school way. And during the war, there were also big pushes for people to grow their own meat and their own food, basically. So they came up with these victory gardens, which you've probably heard of before. And it's basically where people came together all across the country, whether you lived in rural America or if you lived in the suburbs or a city or whatever, there were like gardens all over the place. And people were growing food to basically feed the soldiers overseas and to help feed the people in their local area. During war, you need a lot more food. You're shipping it overseas for your allies, and they were also shipping them overseas to the soldiers. So things like beef and pork were heavily used to help supply the war effort. At the time, beef and pork, they weren't in high supply in America. So instead, what they did was they started marketing to people to grow their own meat. You don't have like any chicken or beef or pork in your backyard. In the cities, you could actually raise rabbits in your backyard because it's very easy. Here, a rabbit setup. So rabbits were used because they were so simple. They were small. They take up a lot less space than raising, a cow. They're very quiet and you could feed them scraps from your garden. So they made for like a nice little dual purpose animal because people were using them for fur and for meat. The fur was being used as trim inside of jackets and coats and stuff. They would make gloves out of it. Fur was really helpful for the men overseas who were fighting the war. And who doesn't like a nice fur coat? I have one. It's so nice and comfy. Anyways, rabbit meat was basically marketed as patriotic, and little pamphlets were in circulation saying 2 does and a buck will keep a family and meat all year. Or have all kinds of different recipes in these pamphlets. It was your duty as an American to grow rabbit. Ask your grandma. This was great, in my opinion, because backyard victory meat put independence back into the American diet. And unfortunately, many people have a very disconnected idea of what it takes to produce a chicken nugget. Back in the 40s, they would just make chicken nuggets out of rabbit nuggets. They'd be rabbit nuggets. We're gonna do some of that on another video. I hacked Chick-fil-A. Great. So basically, the 40s were a golden era of growing your own food, independence, and being patriotic. Got it. Now, shifting past World War II, as soon as V-Day hit, and the war was over, basically the whole rabbit promotion stuff kind of stopped. We'll just say there were some backroom deals in boardrooms of corporate America, which was slowly becoming, we'll just say it was a quiet takeover because money talks and lobbyists. And the Corn Refiners Association. And we didn't even mention the grain elevators. After the war, there were basically surpluses all over the place. You had corn and soy surpluses, basically all the grain surpluses that were not being shipped overseas anymore, bomb fluid left over from the ammonia factories, tractors and combines and things that are basically used to roll across a field in order to produce crops in rural America were developed out of wartime machines. They're basically just repurposed tanks and stuff like that. A lot of the stuff that was used in the war that had nowhere else to go was kind of force-fed into the American food system somehow. Chemicals, heavy machinery, even the food surpluses. So corn and soy didn't have a place to go. So what they did was they basically shifted the marketing of it. And you could see this as a good thing or a bad thing, but the government was trying to avoid a grain collapse in rural America. They created a permanent demand by creating pelletized food and feeding whole grains also, or even crushed grains to livestock. And this was kind of the birth of what you see as today as a feedlot. This also contributed to the animal warehouses of factory farmed chickens. Now, feeding grain to something like a chicken is one thing because it's a bird, it's meant to eat a seed. But feeding grain to something like a cow or a rabbit was not made to eat something like that. You get a shift in balance of nutrients in the way that the animal is finished. It can also upset their gut if they are not fed properly, and it also creates for a less healthy animal. So if you feed a cow what it's supposed to eat, its omegas are not going to get imbalanced. And the same thing goes for a rabbit. More balanced nutrition in an animal, healthier human who eats the animal, and less money in our healthcare system. But instead, beef is later on demonized over chicken because of health issues. But we'll get to that later. So we're dumping tons of grain into livestock feed, which is great for chickens. It's all right for beef and pork. But for rabbits, they don't thrive on this stuff, so they get kind of pushed to the wayside. But that doesn't stop them from putting grain in pelletized feed for rabbits anyway. All of this industrialization in the boardroom that made its way all the way up to the government levels fuels something called the Chicken of Tomorrow contest. And if you don't know what that is, that's where your modern day chicken comes from. Yep. Most of the meat sold around the world, in first world countries at least, is pretty much the same breed of Franken chicken. This happened almost directly after the war ended. And basically, the contest was made in order to find a chicken that could be industrialized on a mass production scale, eat tons of grain, that would grow extremely fast, and it would be able to finish quickly as a very large bird. It was the genetic foundations of basically what we consider modern poultry. And it was a biological machine that would produce meat and eggs on a massive scale. The winner of this contest created the Cornish cross. It's an F1 hybrid chicken, which means that they've taken all these other crosses of other chicken breeds, and only like 2 people know the recipe, or 2 different organizations know the recipe in order to make these chickens. And these chickens cannot be rebred to make more Cornish cross. You basically have to resupply yourself every single year if you want to grow the Cornish cross. So I don't consider them a very homestead sustainable meat source. I would rather just have barnyard chickens that I've bred myself to be big. Almost any chicken that you've ever had, I can almost guarantee it's a Cornish cross. These are the Frankenbirds. I have my own opinions about them. I don't like the idea of the Cornish cross, to be honest. I think it's kind of unethical to breed a bird that has become so fat and lazy and only lives up to 6 weeks. Instead of getting to slaughter weight by like 16, you're not growing a healthy bird, you're growing a fat, lazy bird that oftentimes can be very sickly, hard to keep alive. I've heard some horror stories about growing these birds, but if that's your thing, that's your thing. I'd rather eat ducks and rabbits, to be honest. Now, why the industry chose the chooks over the rabbits was because their production could be automated, I guess you would say, and their processing, it could be mechanized. Also, the Cornish cross would produce a uniform carcass that was very large and easy to cut up, as well as the marketing towards it was that it didn't look like a small dead mammal. They just hacked it up into chicken nuggets and drumsticks and wings. They also later on marketed this as modern and clean and grain dependent. All of this, while rabbits were actually a superior source for nutritional content. They were leaner, more protein dense. They had 3 times the iron, 20 times the B12, 2 times the selenium, and their omega-3 to 6 ratios that we talked about just now. Way better than chicken. Probably because they're eating grass, foraging, So while the rabbits had meat and fur, chickens had meat and eggs. There's 2 food outlets for a chicken, and then you also get a dual purpose with a rabbit, but the unfortunate thing with rabbits is that their dual purpose kind of took a hit. So in the 1950s, there was the introduction of synthetics. Things like acrylic, nylon, polyester, synthetic fibers that create pollution, microplastics, petrochemicals that are leached out into the environment. The production of these synthetics contributes to tons of wastewater pollution. This can be from dyes, solvents, chemicals that are just used in production, flame retardants, finishing agents, plasticizers, whatever the hell that is. Basically tons of crap that stays persistent in the environment and landfills for centuries. And on the health side of it, a lot of these synthetics can cause allergies, skin irritations, and chemical leaching. It's just not, it's not the best. If you catch my drift. You probably could get away with better stuff like hemp or silk, or just stick to the furs. There's also something called banana tex. Banana tex is like fibers from a banana plant. They just take the fibers out of the plant, roll it up into a yarn, I guess. Speaking of, you could also have wool instead of acrylic. Cotton, linen, anything but fake petro shit. As far as dual purposes goes, rabbits are really getting left behind. But that's not even the nail in the coffin, because what happens next really brings them down to here. While chicken, beef, and pork are skyrocketing in popularity, anything that's left out of centralization that can't be industrialized is getting left behind, like fast. This whole process is creating what we call a normal food system. Normal being we're dependent on 3 species to feed an entire country. Rabbits are considered a non-amenable species, which means that they don't have to be regulated by the USDA. But you can have a stamp put on your rabbit meat if you're selling it that is inspected by the USDA if you want to. Now, I don't think needing an inspection is necessarily a good or a bad thing. It just depends on where you lie on the spectrum of wanting the government to control your food supply. So I'm not so mad that they're considered a non-amenable species, because that means that if I fall within the regulatory parameters, because they are regulated to an extent state by state, I can still sell my meat to the public and not have to use a USDA inspected facility. But the unfortunate side of that is that if you wanted to scale it to a level where you are selling across state lines, it's going to be possibly cost prohibitive, because there's not very many slaughter facilities in the US that will process at that scale for rabbits. So along with these massive campaigns that are kind of pushing rabbits out of the picture, you also have things like Bugs Bunny cartoons and the Easter Bunny, basically making an image of rabbits as these cute little creatures that shouldn't be hunted, and they're seen as pets, as well as poor man's food, because it's what we ate during the war when we couldn't afford afford to buy a cow because they were in so high demand, nobody could get their hands on one. Meanwhile, Big Chicken is putting its fat ass crown on its head because the next thing that happens is going after beef.
Okay, so I said we weren't really going to talk about the grain elevators, but in order to touch on the beef, we're kind of going to have to talk about the grain elevators because they have something to do with this. Basically what a grain elevator is like a station along the railroad tracks. When the grain elevators went up, they were basically supposed to be controlled by the locals. They would take the grain and hoist it up onto the rail cars so that the rail cars could go across the country and deliver to where it needed to be. The grain elevators, or at least who controlled them, they controlled the storage of it, the grading of the corn itself, or the grain in general, the pricing, and then when it could or could not be unloaded onto the cars. So the farmers were kind of like subject to when they could put their corn or any grain onto the rail cars and the prices. They had no control over any of that stuff. We're getting kind of close to the time period of the 70s at this point, so that's where this comes into play, because by the 70s, the grain elevators were controlled by those big corporations such as Tyson, Cargill, and Purdue. These were no longer owned by local co-ops or anything. These were now corporatized things, unfortunately. But it was basically the backbone of the grain industry. If you just keep in the back of your mind those big giants, that's how this is coming into play, and we'll roll into that.
Okay, so by the 70s, there was a beef price crisis. Nixon came into office and basically shut down the gold standard of the US dollar. Yes, this goes into the financial system. Congratulations, we're going to talk about it. Welcome all conspiracy theorists. You're right at home. Overnight, after the US dollar is no longer backed by gold, it loses its value instantly. Agricultural exports become extremely cheap to sell to other countries. Of course, since the grain industry has been trying to sell their shit everywhere, the global demand for corn skyrockets. The funny thing is that corn evolved in America. So when the global demand went up, the cheap grain that was being sold all over the place in massive quantities depleted the U.S. supply significantly. They called this the Great Grain Robbery, specifically when they sold tons of it to the Soviet Union. Since our reserve in the U.S. was completely drained, or damn near, it drove our domestic prices of grain way up. Feed went up, so the cost of producing an animal on grain also went up. This drove us into a feedback loop of ranchers selling off their entire herds, or almost all of them, for extremely cheap prices because the cost of grain was so unaffordable they couldn't keep them around. As a result, when the beef supply was lowered, prices go up. Supply, demand. The next thing Nixon did was to try and implement price controls to maybe balance out the market, but it didn't really help. Even though it froze things like wages and prices, it did not freeze things like feed and fuel. The things, unfortunately, that were controlled were the things that impacted the farmers and ranchers the most. Cattle producers were losing money because they were not actually able to charge more for their cattle, but they were paying more in order to feed them. So it was a little bit cost prohibitive. Many ranchers sold off their entire herds, or they just stopped producing entirely. It just wasn't feasible anymore. What are you supposed to do? This shrank the beef supply even more, and the costs of beef and even consuming beef went up even more. The price controlling that Nixon implemented completely backfired. And when the price controls were lifted, they surged dramatically because the market was not able to rebalance itself. Then if you would have completely left alone, it wouldn't have been as bad of a situation. And here's my question for you. Does that mean that our dependency on grain or anything, good or bad? Because we're about to get in the weeds a little bit more because the story gets even deeper. But I think what it highlights is there's a problem with centralization. And it's funny because it's not just involved with food, it's involving the financial system, our transportation system, and even our healthcare system. So we're going to stay stuck on beef for a few minutes, and this is going to come around here in a little bit, so just hang tight. So by the late 1970s, they released the dietary goals for the United States. This is shockingly selectively interpreted and massively influenced by industry. But there's no surprise there, is there? It was meant to kind of help people eat less cholesterol, fat, sugar, and red meat. This was kind of because of all that lipid hypothesis BS that was going on at the time that created a bunch of health scares and led to a whole bunch of like low-fat diet crazes. The funny thing is that we replaced fat with grains, cholesterol with corn oils, because the cholesterol was supposedly coming from things like butter. We replaced sugar with high fructose corn syrup. We all know how I love that one. And then we also replaced red meat with, you guessed it, chickens that eat lots of grain. This is starting to make sense now, isn't it? The system was becoming very grain heavy, and low-fat diets were promoted because they were becoming the base of the food pyramid system that came very shortly after. By now, you're probably wondering, why does this even matter and how does it even relate to chickens and rabbits? Well, it's because chickens were basically rebranded as healthier, and the reason for that was because Big Grain had its fingers all up in there, and they were promoting chicken because chicken is Big Grain's biggest customer. And that's because 60 to 70% of the money spent on growing a chicken is spent in grain. So they didn't want to lose their big buddy. They propped him up. The little guy grain dealers back in the early 1900s, they became big poultry giants like Purdue and Tyson, Cargill and Conagra. All these big companies that basically built the whole system that is vertically integrated to support the grain industry. They own the feed mills, they're contracted with growers, and they own the hatcheries, the processing plants, and the distribution centers. Big Grain basically pushed out beef, sugar, and any small operations that were out in the market, and they dominated the entire space. Rabbits, they basically had no chance at all. By the 1980s, chicken nuggets, they were basically portable protein. And every time you eat a chicken nugget now, you might start questioning yourself, what are the alternatives? And why don't I get any alternatives? AKA, why can't I learn how to make chicken nuggets out of rabbit? What it really is mid-century programming disguised as progress, not nutritional truth. And by the 90s, chicken officially outsold beef because it was promoted as healthier. And to this day, people are still buying it. Buying the idea, not just the chicken. Ultimately, rabbits weren't the only meat option. They were just pushed aside for profit, industrialized margins. They could be raised in your backyard and consuming the dollars of the grain, which is now our gold standard is a freaking corn. Okay, it's really sad. But I mean, they weren't the only animal that was pushed aside. You know, things like goats, bison, and Muscovy ducks, they would have been great options. I'm not the one pulling strings here. I wasn't around back then, but goats are probably one of the #1 animals that's fed to people around the entire world. Almost every other country eats goats, like a lot. And bison, they don't only roam the American plains. So why didn't bison meat make it into the American diet? Well, that's because they were mostly killed off in the 1800s to cut off the food supply for the Native Americans. Dark history. Welcome to it. Here's our food system. Muscovy ducks, why are they not a thing? I don't know. They're larger than most poultry. They eat the yard. They reproduce like crazy. They're quiet, great foragers. I don't know. Make tacos, make ground beef, or ground duck, I guess. There's lots of options for them. Anyway, this is chocolate. This is home skillet. So if we really had one thing to say about why chickens beat rabbits in the whole food arms race, honestly, it all comes down to money. Unfortunately, that's everything these days. Welcome to Consumers America. I'm Jordan. Thank you for tagging along with me in the Rebel Food Systems and Rebel Off Grid, wherever you're watching. Take care, and I hope you eat some real meat, at least sometime this week.
forgot to mention, if you're curious about raising rabbits, visit Rebel Off Grid, and if you feel so inclined, buy me a cup of tea.